August 19, 1944, 8:40 hours. Wolfschanz headquarters, East Prussia. Inside a concrete bunker buried deep in the forests of Rassenburg, Colonel General Alfred Jodl leaned over a large operations map of Western Europe. Colored pins marked the Allied advance across France. Blue markers, American spearheads. Red markers, retreating German units. Jodl slowly traced a line with his finger. From the beaches of Normandy. Across the shattered fields of northern France. Toward the Seine River. Nearly 400 miles. On paper, the situation looked obvious. The Americans had advanced too fast. No army in modern history could sustain such speed. Armored warfare obeyed one brutal law: fuel. And fuel meant distance. Every German officer in the room understood the mathematics. A single armored division consumed roughly 150,000 gallons of fuel every day while advancing. Tanks burned fuel faster than artillery could fire shells. Trucks required constant resupply. Engines broke down. Convoys stretched across hundreds of miles. Supply lines always broke first. That had been the hidden weakness of Blitzkrieg itself. Germany had learned this lesson the hard way on the endless plains of the Soviet Union. Now Jodl believed the Americans were about to learn it too. He straightened up and spoke quietly to the officers gathered around the map. The enemy has outrun his logistics. No one argued. The calculations were clear. Patton's Third Army was now operating 400 miles from its original supply bases in Normandy. Even if the Americans possessed thousands of trucks. Even if their roads were intact. Even if their vehicles never broke down. The mathematics still made their advance impossible. An army that moved too far, too fast, eventually starved itself. Fuel ran out. Ammunition ran out. Engines stopped. When that moment came, the advance collapsed. Jodl's staff had already estimated when it would happen. Within 48 hours, perhaps less. Patton's tanks would stop. And when they stopped, the Wehrmacht would finally have time. Time to regroup. Time to build defensive lines along the Seine. Time to stabilize the Western Front before winter arrived. From the German perspective, the American advance looked less like a victory. And more like a fatal mistake. What Jodl could not see from his bunker in East Prussia was what was already happening far to the west. Just 125 miles behind the American front lines, a logistical operation unlike anything in military history had already begun. An endless column of trucks was rolling east across France. Thousands of engines. Thousands of headlights burning through the night. Drivers ignoring blackout rules that had governed warfare for decades. Convoys stretching for miles across the countryside. They moved without pause. Without camouflage. Without even attempting to hide. Every 5 minutes, another convoy departed. Each truck carried 5 tons of supplies. Fuel. Ammunition. Rations. Spare parts. Everything an army needed to keep moving. Together they were delivering over 12,500 tons of supplies every single day. The operation had a name few German officers had yet heard. The Red Ball Express. It was not a railway. Not a pipeline. Not a traditional supply network. It was something entirely new. A one-way highway system built almost overnight across liberated France. Nearly 6,000 trucks driving day and night. By the time German intelligence fully understood what was happening, the system was already unstoppable. Within 72 hours, Patton's supposedly exhausted tanks would cross the Seine. Within 1 week, Allied forces would enter Paris. Within a single month, American armored columns would reach the German border. The German High Command believed the Americans had reached the limits of logistics. In reality, the Americans were about to redefine what logistics meant. And the men who would prove it were not famous generals. or decorated tank commanders. They were 23,000 truck drivers. Most of them young. Most of them unknown. And nearly 75% of them African American soldiers serving in a segregated U.S. Army. These drivers were about to turn a simple road network into the most powerful supply system the world had ever seen. For the German generals watching the war from their headquarters, the lesson would come too late. Because the Red Ball Express was not just delivering fuel and ammunition. It was delivering something far more dangerous. Industrial warfare in motion. At that moment, the German High Command believed one thing with near absolute certainty. Patton's advance could not continue. Not for long. Not at that speed. Not across that distance. And from the German point of view, that belief was not irrational. It was built on experience, on doctrine, and on the hard lessons of 6 years of mechanized war. The Wehrmacht had pioneered fast operational warfare in Poland, in France, and in the opening stages of the Soviet campaign. German generals understood better than most armies in the world that victory at the front meant nothing if trucks, fuel, ammunition, and spare parts could not keep pace behind it. Blitzkrieg had always depended on motion. But motion had always carried a hidden cost. The farther a spearhead advanced, the weaker it became. Engines wore out. Tracks failed. Fuel trucks lagged behind. Bridges collapsed. Railheads remained too far to the rear. Roads became clogged with traffic, refugees, wounded men, and broken vehicles. The Germans had lived this reality in Russia. In 1941 and 1942, entire offensives slowed not because Soviet resistance suddenly became unbeatable, but because logistics finally caught up with German ambition. Trucks broke apart on bad roads. Horse-drawn wagons, still responsible for the majority of German transport, could never sustain the pace of armored columns. Supplies piled up at railheads hundreds of miles from the fighting because the railway gauge was different. Panzer commanders repeatedly found themselves in the same position: tactical success at the front, strategic paralysis behind it. So when Jodl and his staff studied the American advance in August 1944, they believed they were watching the same pattern repeat itself. Only this time, it would happen to the enemy. German intelligence officers worked through the numbers with cold confidence. An infantry division required around 700 tons of supplies every day. An armored division needed roughly 1,000 tons or more. Patton's Third Army was operating with multiple corps spread across a broad front. Its leading units had raced deep into France, far beyond the carefully prepared supply structure that had supported the Normandy landings. To the Wehrmacht, the conclusion was obvious. No army could move that far that fast and remain fully supplied. Especially not across a transportation network already damaged by months of bombing and further wrecked by German retreat. Bridges had been blown. Railway junctions were in ruins. Roads were cratered, congested, or reduced to dust by constant military traffic. Any logistician using European standards would have concluded the same thing: the Americans had reached the natural culminating point of their offensive. General officers in the German command phrased it in different ways, but the idea was always the same. The Americans had become victims of their own success. The faster Patton moved, the more fragile his spearheads became. Every mile east widened the gap between his tanks and the beaches that fed them. Every day of advance multiplied his fuel requirements. Every successful breakthrough increased the strain on transport. In German thinking, speed itself was now the Americans' greatest liability. There were reasons this confidence spread far beyond Jodl's headquarters. German planners knew their enemy used machines on a scale unprecedented in Europe. They also believed that this mechanical advantage carried its own fatal weakness. Machines consumed fuel. Machines required parts. Machines demanded maintenance. A horse could graze. A truck could not. A man could march on reduced rations. A Sherman tank could not move an inch without gasoline. To German officers trained in the realities of continental warfare, the American way of war looked unsustainable by its very nature. Some even believed the problem was larger than Patton alone. If the U.S. Army had advanced 400 miles in barely a month, then it had done so by stretching every part of its system to the breaking point. Fuel had to come from ports. Ammunition had to come from depots. Spare parts had to be moved forward through multiple transfer points. Every truck committed to the front consumed fuel itself. The supply chain was burning fuel simply to move more fuel. That logic reassured the Germans. They did not need to destroy the American advance outright. They only had to wait for it to collapse under its own weight. In conference rooms and headquarters bunkers, this became a kind of operational faith. Hold a little longer. Delay where possible. Trade space for time. Let the Americans extend themselves. Let their armor outrun its support. Once their spearheads halted, the Wehrmacht could reorganize, establish fresh defensive lines, and perhaps restore some kind of balance in the West. For a command system under enormous pressure, this belief was more than analysis. It was hope made mathematical. If Patton stalled at the Seine, the war in France might slow. If the war in France slowed, perhaps winter would intervene. If winter came before the Germans broke completely, then the front might stabilize. And if the front stabilized, then Germany still had a chance to prolong the war. This was the mental world of the German High Command in late August 1944, not optimism in final victory, but confidence that logistics would achieve what battlefield resistance could not. They trusted the limits of distance. They trusted the weight of fuel consumption. They trusted the old laws of mechanized war. What they did not yet understand was that the Americans were not trying to solve the logistical problem in the traditional European way. They were about to overwhelm it. On paper, the situation appeared almost perfect for the German defenders. If the American advance truly depended on long supply lines stretching back to Normandy, then the mathematics of war should eventually stop it. The entire system of modern mechanized warfare depended on logistics. Fuel. Ammunition. Food. Spare parts. Without these, even the most powerful army became immobile. German staff officers had calculated the requirements in detail. An infantry division needed approximately 700 tons of supplies every day to remain operational. An armored division required even more, often 1,000 tons or more daily once tanks, artillery, and mechanized vehicles were in constant motion. Patton's Third Army controlled 12 divisions, spread across a front more than 60 miles wide. Simple arithmetic produced an intimidating number. Nearly 12,000 tons of supplies every single day. And those supplies had to travel from the original invasion ports and beaches in Normandy, more than 400 miles away from the advancing spearheads. The transportation network between those points was in terrible condition. Months of Allied bombing had already shattered railways, bridges, and junctions across northern France. German retreating forces had destroyed even more infrastructure as they withdrew. Railroads had been cut in hundreds of places. Bridges across major rivers had been demolished. Entire highway intersections had been mined or cratered. To the German General Staff, this damage was not a problem, it was an advantage. Every destroyed bridge forced trucks onto longer detours. Every ruined railway delayed supply trains. Every kilometer of damaged road increased fuel consumption. The Americans were trying to supply a massive army across territory that had been systematically wrecked during the fighting. German planners believed that no logistical system could survive such conditions. Their assumptions were based on how European armies had always operated. Traditionally, supply systems worked in carefully structured layers. First came major depots near ports or railheads. From these depots, supplies moved forward to intermediate distribution centers. From there, smaller convoys carried supplies to corps and divisional depots. Finally, local transport units delivered materials to combat units near the front. This system was efficient, but slow. Every transfer point created delays. Every stage required planning. Every movement required coordination between multiple commands. In German doctrine, such systems could only function if the front advanced at a controlled pace. When advances became too rapid, the system broke down. Rail lines could not be extended fast enough. Truck fleets became exhausted. Maintenance capacity collapsed. The Germans had already experienced these exact problems in Russia. In 1941, panzer divisions had raced hundreds of miles ahead of their railheads. Within weeks, German supply columns could no longer keep up. Fuel shortages began appearing at the front. Artillery units received reduced ammunition allocations. Entire divisions were forced to halt while supplies caught up. It was a brutal lesson. Speed created vulnerability. Now German officers believed the Americans were repeating the same mistake. The numbers seemed to confirm it. Even if the United States possessed enormous industrial capacity, it still had to obey the physical limits of transportation. Trucks had limited range. Drivers required rest. Vehicles broke down. Fuel trucks themselves consumed fuel while delivering it. The system would eventually choke on its own complexity. German intelligence officers reviewing aerial reconnaissance added further confirmation. Reports described thousands of American vehicles crowding French roads. Convoys stretched for miles. Traffic jams appeared near major crossroads. Fuel consumption appeared enormous. To German analysts, these were signs of a logistical system already under strain. One senior officer summarized the situation bluntly in a staff briefing. The enemy is advancing faster than his supply system was designed to support. If the Wehrmacht could delay long enough, the Americans would be forced to stop. And when that moment came, the entire Allied advance might stall across France. But these calculations contained one critical assumption. They assumed the Americans were trying to operate their supply system the same way European armies always had. They were not. While German planners were calculating the limits of traditional logistics, the Americans were already building an entirely new system. A supply network based not on careful efficiency, but on overwhelming scale. And within days, that system would begin to move. At first, the reports reaching German headquarters seemed small. Isolated observations. Minor anomalies. Nothing that challenged the overall conclusion that the American advance would soon stop. But scattered across France, German reconnaissance units were beginning to notice something unusual. On August 28, 1944, forward observers from a German reconnaissance battalion reported strange activity along several roads west of Paris. What they saw did not resemble normal military logistics. There were trucks. Thousands of them. Moving in continuous columns. Headlights blazing openly through the night. This alone was shocking. For years, German doctrine had enforced strict blackout discipline. Vehicles moved in darkness without lights to avoid air attack. Convoys were spaced widely to prevent catastrophic traffic jams if one vehicle broke down. The Americans appeared to be ignoring all of these rules. Their trucks drove with headlights on. They drove close together. Sometimes separated by only a few dozen meters. And most alarming of all, they never seemed to stop. German observers reported vehicle columns stretching for kilometers across the countryside. One reconnaissance report estimated that nearly 1,000 trucks passed a single observation point in just 1 hour. At first, staff officers dismissed the reports as exaggeration. Frontline units often overestimated enemy activity. But additional messages began arriving from other sectors. Another German unit reported continuous truck movement along a secondary road south of Chartres. A third report described convoys appearing every few minutes on roads leading toward the American front. One officer noted something that seemed almost impossible. The traffic moved both day and night. No pause. No breaks. No sign of the usual supply rhythm that armies normally followed. Even more confusing, the trucks did not appear to follow strict convoy formations. Instead, vehicles seemed to flow along the roads in a constant stream. As if the entire countryside had become one enormous transportation network. These observations puzzled German intelligence officers. Traditional military supply systems did not operate this way. Convoys normally departed in carefully scheduled groups. They halted at depots. They unloaded supplies. Then they returned for new cargo. What German observers were seeing looked different. There were too many trucks. They moved too quickly. And they appeared to operate under completely different rules. Some reports described trucks driving at speeds of 35 miles per hour, far faster than typical military convoys. Others noted that damaged vehicles were simply pushed off the road rather than repaired immediately. To German officers trained in careful logistical planning, such behavior looked reckless. One intelligence summary described the phenomenon cautiously. The enemy appears to be operating an unusually large number of transport vehicles along major supply routes. Movement continues without interruption. But even then, the true scale of the operation remained unclear. German commanders still believed these convoys were temporary. Perhaps emergency supply movements. Perhaps a desperate attempt to keep Patton's forces moving a few days longer. Certainly not a sustainable system. After all, no army could maintain such an enormous flow of vehicles for long. Fuel consumption alone would make it impossible. Yet with every passing day, the reports grew more alarming. Columns of trucks continued moving east. Drivers ignored darkness. Traffic never slowed. And the numbers kept growing. Something was happening behind the American front lines. Something the German command structure had never encountered before. At first it looked like chaos. But in reality, it was the early sign of a system that would soon reshape the entire battlefield. Then the German command finally understood what they were looking at. And the scale was unlike anything they had imagined. By early September 1944, intelligence officers had pieced together the scattered reconnaissance reports coming from across northern France. What had first appeared to be isolated truck convoys was now revealed to be something far larger. It was not a convoy. It was a system. Across the road stretching from Cherbourg and the Normandy beaches toward the front, American transport vehicles were moving in an almost uninterrupted stream. Not dozens. Not hundreds. Thousands of trucks. Every day. Every night. The numbers were staggering even by wartime standards. German intelligence estimated that nearly 6,000 trucks were involved in the operation at any given time. At peak activity, as many as 7,000 vehicles were operating across the supply routes. Each truck carried approximately 5 tons of cargo. Fuel. Ammunition. Food. Medical supplies. Spare parts. Everything required to sustain a modern mechanized army. Together, these convoys were delivering more than 12,500 tons of supplies every single day to the advancing Allied forces. For German planners accustomed to carefully rationed logistics, the scale bordered on the unbelievable. Many Wehrmacht divisions were accustomed to receiving only a fraction of that amount over several days. Yet the Americans were delivering that volume daily. And they were doing it across a distance that German officers believed impossible. The round trip for many trucks approached 686 miles. Drivers covered the distance in roughly 14 hours of driving, often operating their vehicles nearly continuously. At any given moment, about 5,000 trucks were in motion along the supply routes. Convoys departed their starting points roughly every 5 minutes. Each convoy typically contained around 60 to 70 vehicles. The movement never stopped. While one convoy moved east loaded with supplies, another convoy was already returning west with empty trucks ready to reload. 2 entire highway systems had effectively been created. One road carried trucks toward the front. Another road carried them back. This allowed the entire network to function as a continuous flow rather than a series of individual convoys. The Americans had transformed the road network of France into a giant moving conveyor belt. To German officers trained in the traditional methods of European warfare, this was something entirely new. Their logistics had always depended on careful planning, strict discipline, and conservation of resources. The American system appeared to ignore all of these principles. Instead of minimizing vehicle use, they deployed thousands. Instead of avoiding mechanical failure, they simply expected it. Instead of protecting vehicles carefully, they pushed them to their limits. Broken trucks were often pushed off the road and abandoned. Replacement vehicles appeared constantly from rear depots. Drivers worked extreme hours. Maintenance teams performed repairs directly along the roadside. From a German perspective, the entire system looked wildly inefficient. Yet the results were undeniable. The American armies were not slowing down. They were accelerating. One intelligence officer summarized the situation in a briefing to senior commanders. The enemy has created a supply system based on continuous movement rather than controlled delivery. Even this description failed to capture the true shock. German staff officers had always believed that logistics imposed strict limits on military operations. The Americans appeared to be ignoring those limits entirely. They had replaced efficiency with scale. And scale was proving far more powerful. For the first time, German commanders began to suspect something unsettling. If the Americans could maintain such a system, then the logistical collapse they were waiting for might never come. With every passing day, the situation grew worse for German planners. The collapse they had expected never came. Instead, American forces continued advancing deeper into France, moving at a pace that shattered every assumption of European military logistics. Reports from the front lines painted an increasingly alarming picture. German defensive units attempting to slow the Allied advance found themselves overwhelmed not only by tanks and artillery, but by the sheer volume of supplies feeding the American armies. Field reports described the same pattern again and again. Every destroyed vehicle was replaced within hours. Every exhausted unit was quickly resupplied. Every artillery barrage was followed by another, and then another. The numbers in the reports became difficult to believe. American artillery units were firing ammunition at a rate that German commanders had not seen since the early years of the war. In several sectors, Allied guns fired tens of thousands of shells in a single day. German artillery officers, who were often restricted to dozens of rounds per gun per day, could only watch the disparity grow. Fuel supplies revealed an even more dramatic imbalance. American armored units rarely halted for lack of gasoline. Tank columns refueled quickly and continued advancing. Supply trucks appeared constantly behind them. Behind this seemingly endless supply chain stood the Red Ball Express. The system was consuming enormous resources. The trucks alone burned approximately 300,000 gallons of fuel every day just to keep the operation moving. For many European armies, that amount of fuel would have supported entire armored formations. Yet for the Americans, it was simply the cost of keeping the supply system running. What shocked German observers even more was how easily the Americans absorbed losses within the system. Truck breakdowns occurred constantly. Nearly 1,800 vehicles per day required repairs or replacement due to mechanical failure. Under traditional logistics doctrine, such attrition would have crippled a transport network. But the Americans had anticipated it. Maintenance units operated directly along the supply routes. Mechanics worked beside the roads, repairing vehicles under emergency conditions. They adopted a simple rule. If a truck could not be repaired within 15 minutes, it was pushed off the road and abandoned. The convoy behind it continued moving. Spare parts were taken from damaged vehicles. Engines were swapped using mobile cranes. Replacement trucks arrived from depots in the rear. This brutal efficiency kept the entire system flowing. To German logisticians, the method seemed wasteful. But waste was precisely what the American system could afford. Where the Germans struggled to conserve every truck, every engine, every liter of fuel, the Americans simply replaced what they lost. And behind the trucks stood another supply innovation that German intelligence had failed to fully detect. Fuel pipelines. Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, had begun pumping gasoline from Britain directly into France through underwater pipelines laid beneath the English Channel. By late summer 1944, fuel flowed continuously from Britain to the European mainland. From there, tanker trucks distributed gasoline to supply depots placed roughly every 25 miles along the Red Ball routes. This meant that supply vehicles rarely had to wait long for refueling. Most trucks could refuel within 10 minutes before continuing their journey. For the German command structure, these developments created a growing sense of unease. The American system seemed almost immune to the traditional weaknesses of logistics. Fuel shortages did not appear. Ammunition supplies never ran dry. Transport losses were quickly replaced. And the longer the system operated, the more efficient it became. Meanwhile, German supply networks were collapsing under the pressure of constant Allied air attacks. Roads were bombed. Railways were destroyed. Transport convoys were hunted by fighter bombers. In many areas, German units could barely move supplies during daylight hours. The contrast between the two systems became impossible to ignore. One army struggled to move ammunition to the front. The other was flooding the battlefield with resources. And slowly, German commanders began to understand something deeply troubling. The Red Ball Express was not simply keeping the American army supplied. It was multiplying its power. The real problem facing the German command came down to a simple contrast. On one side stood the Wehrmacht. An army that had mastered maneuver warfare, but was now fighting with shrinking resources. On the other side stood the United States Army. An army that was still learning modern warfare, but possessed industrial strength on a scale the Germans had never faced before. The difference began with transportation. German logistics in 1944 still relied heavily on animals. Nearly 80% of German military transport used horses. Entire supply columns moved at walking speed. A wagon train might cover 15 to 20 miles in a day under good conditions. Fuel shortages meant many German trucks sat idle. Spare parts were scarce. Engines wore out faster than they could be replaced. In contrast, the American Army operated a transportation network built entirely around machines. The backbone of the Red Ball Express was the GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck, known by soldiers simply as the Deuce and a Half. More than 500,000 of these trucks were produced during the war. This meant the United States possessed more standardized transport vehicles than the entire German military combined. Each truck could carry 5 tons of cargo. With thousands of vehicles moving continuously, the amount of material flowing toward the front became enormous. The difference became even clearer when examining fuel supplies. By 1944, Germany's fuel situation had become desperate. Synthetic fuel plants and Romanian oil fields could produce only limited amounts. The entire German war machine had to ration every liter. American forces faced the opposite situation. The United States produced roughly 2/3 of the world's oil supply during the war. Fuel was not scarce. Fuel was abundant. So abundant that American logistics planners could design systems that consumed enormous quantities of gasoline without threatening national reserves. The Red Ball Express itself burned 300,000 gallons per day just to operate. But the American military still delivered far more fuel to the front than the trucks consumed. The contrast extended beyond fuel. It affected every element of supply. American factories produced trucks, tanks, aircraft, and spare parts at staggering speed. If a vehicle broke down permanently, it could simply be replaced. If a convoy lost trucks, new ones arrived within days. If roads were destroyed, engineers rebuilt them quickly. German forces did not have this luxury. Every lost vehicle was difficult to replace. Every damaged bridge created a major obstacle. Every destroyed railway slowed the entire supply chain. The Americans fought with abundance. The Germans fought with scarcity. Even the design of equipment reflected this difference. American vehicles were built for reliability and easy maintenance. Parts were standardized. Engines were simple. Mechanics could swap components quickly. German equipment was often technically advanced, but complicated. Different vehicles required different parts. Repairs took longer. Maintenance demanded skilled technicians. In theory, German machines were superior. In practice, American machines were easier to keep moving. And in war, movement mattered more than elegance. The contrast also extended to command philosophy. German logistics followed strict hierarchy. Orders moved slowly through the chain of command. Decisions required approval from senior officers. The American system operated differently. Junior officers and even sergeants made rapid decisions on the ground. Convoy commanders rerouted traffic. Mechanics improvised repairs. Drivers created alternate routes when roads became blocked. This decentralized flexibility allowed the system to adapt quickly. Where German logistics emphasized discipline and conservation, American logistics emphasized speed and scale. One system tried to carefully manage limited resources. The other overwhelmed problems with industrial abundance. The result was a collision between two very different visions of warfare. One built on precision and efficiency. The other built on production and volume. And by late summer 1944, that difference was beginning to decide the outcome of the campaign in France. For weeks, German commanders had waited for the same moment. The moment when the American advance would finally slow. The moment when Patton's armored spearheads would run out of fuel. The moment when distance would defeat the enemy. But that moment never arrived. Instead, the opposite happened. By early September 1944, American forces were advancing faster than German intelligence believed physically possible. Entire armored divisions were covering 40 to 60 miles per day. Some units advanced even farther. On September 1, 1944, the U.S. 4th Armored Division pushed forward 35 miles in the morning, halted briefly for resupply, and then advanced another 32 miles the same afternoon. A 67-mile advance in a single day. For German planners, this shattered the foundation of their calculations. Traditional military doctrine assumed that armored formations could sustain 20 to 30 miles of advance per day at most under ideal conditions. Beyond that distance, fuel consumption and mechanical failures normally forced a pause. But Patton's army was not pausing. Every time American spearheads halted, trucks from the Red Ball Express were already waiting. Fuel arrived. Ammunition arrived. Food arrived. Within hours, the columns moved again. German commanders began reviewing the intelligence reports more carefully. The numbers were disturbing. The Red Ball Express was delivering over 12,000 tons of supplies daily. Thousands of trucks were moving continuously. Mechanical failures reached 30% of vehicles per day, a rate that would normally destroy a logistics system. Yet the Americans simply replaced the damaged vehicles. The system did not collapse. It adapted. Intercepted radio traffic confirmed the worst fears of the German General Staff. American units often transmitted their positions openly. They showed little concern for operational secrecy. Their confidence seemed almost reckless. But the reason was simple. They believed, correctly, that they could move faster than the Germans could react. One of the first senior commanders to grasp the full meaning of this was Field Marshal Walter Model. After reviewing the intelligence summaries, he reportedly spoke bluntly to his staff. If these reports are accurate, he said, then we are no longer facing a superior army. He paused before finishing the sentence. We are facing a superior civilization. The Americans were not trying to conserve resources. They were overwhelming every logistical obstacle with sheer production. They did not worry about losing trucks. They had thousands more. They did not worry about fuel consumption. Their oil supply dwarfed anything Germany possessed. They did not worry about mechanical attrition. Factories across the Atlantic were replacing equipment faster than it could be destroyed. German officers began to realize that the war they were fighting had changed. It was no longer a contest of maneuver or battlefield brilliance. It was becoming a contest of industrial power. And in that contest, Germany was hopelessly outmatched. One captured German officer later summarized the moment with painful clarity. When we finally understood the scale of the American supply system, he said, we knew the war was already lost. Because the Red Ball Express had done something unprecedented in military history. It had removed the traditional limits of logistics. Distance no longer slowed the Allied armies. Fuel no longer restricted their movement. Supplies arrived faster than they could be consumed. And with that realization, the German command finally understood the truth. The Allied advance would not stop. By October 1944, the consequences of the Red Ball Express were already visible across Western Europe. What had begun as a desperate emergency supply operation had transformed into one of the most decisive logistical systems of the entire war. Patton's Third Army had not stalled. It had surged forward across France at a speed that stunned even Allied planners. Within weeks of the Normandy breakout, American forces had helped liberate Paris, pushed across the Seine River, and advanced toward the German border. German defensive plans collapsed one after another. Positions that had been expected to hold for weeks were bypassed or overwhelmed within days. Entire Wehrmacht formations retreated continuously, unable to establish stable defensive lines. Behind every American advance stood the same invisible force. Fuel. Ammunition. Food. Spare parts. All delivered by the relentless flow of trucks moving along the Red Ball routes. For 82 days, the system operated without interruption. During that time, the Red Ball Express delivered astonishing quantities of material. More than 412,000 tons of supplies reached the Allied armies. The trucks traveled a combined distance of over 120 million ton-miles. Nearly 6,000 vehicles operated daily, sometimes rising to 7,000 trucks during peak periods. More than 23,000 drivers kept the system running. The cost was enormous. Approximately 5,000 trucks were destroyed, abandoned, or worn out during the operation. Tires were consumed at extraordinary rates. Engines burned out under constant strain. Fuel consumption reached tens of millions of gallons. Yet the American industrial system absorbed those losses without slowing the flow of supplies. Replacement vehicles arrived continuously from factories and ports. New drivers were trained in days and placed immediately into convoys. The Red Ball Express had become a machine that fed an entire army. German commanders studying the situation could see the consequences clearly. Their forces were fighting with limited ammunition, limited fuel, and shrinking transport capacity. Meanwhile, the Allies operated with abundance. American artillery fired without ration. Armored divisions moved whenever commanders chose. Air forces operated in overwhelming numbers. The imbalance was not simply tactical. It was structural. By the autumn of 1944, the German army in the West was no longer being defeated only on the battlefield. It was being defeated by a supply system that Germany could neither match nor destroy. Field Marshal Walter Model later summarized the situation bluntly in his final reports. "We were not defeated primarily by American tanks or aircraft," he wrote. "We were defeated by American logistics." Even captured German officers admitted the same conclusion. Many had initially dismissed American logistics as inefficient and wasteful. They believed the United States relied too heavily on machines. But by the time the war reached Germany's borders, those assumptions had collapsed. The Americans had turned their industrial power into a weapon. A weapon that moved not on tank tracks, but on truck tires. And by the time German commanders fully understood this truth, the outcome of the war in Western Europe had already been decided. This story revealed a simple truth about modern warfare. Wars are not won only by courage. They are not won only by brilliant tactics. And they are not decided solely by the skill of generals on the battlefield. They are won by something far less visible. Logistics. For centuries, armies had fought under the same limitation: distance. The farther soldiers moved from their supply bases, the weaker they became. Food ran out. Ammunition disappeared. Horses collapsed. Engines stopped. Every campaign in history eventually reached the same point. The point where an army could advance no farther. German generals believed that moment would stop the Americans in 1944. Instead, the Americans eliminated the problem entirely. The Red Ball Express demonstrated a new kind of warfare, industrial warfare in motion. Rather than carefully conserving resources, the United States overwhelmed the battlefield with production. Where traditional armies tried to move supplies efficiently, the Americans moved them relentlessly. Thousands of trucks. Millions of gallons of fuel. Hundreds of thousands of tons of cargo. And behind those trucks stood an industrial system that Germany could never match. Factories produced replacement vehicles faster than they could be destroyed. Oil fields pumped fuel faster than armies could burn it. Ports unloaded ships faster than the front could consume their cargo. The Red Ball Express was not elegant. It was not efficient by traditional military standards. Trucks broke down constantly. Drivers pushed themselves to exhaustion. Vehicles were abandoned along the roadside. Fuel consumption reached astonishing levels. But none of that mattered. Because the system did not rely on perfection. It relied on scale. American commanders accepted waste because they possessed resources beyond the imagination of their enemies. German officers eventually understood this reality. One captured commander later explained the moment of realization. "We thought we were fighting an army," he said. "In reality, we were fighting an entire industrial continent." For the Wehrmacht, the Red Ball Express represented something even more frightening than tanks or aircraft. It represented the transformation of logistics into strategy. The American armies did not stop because they never ran out of the things that stopped armies: fuel, ammunition, spare parts, transportation. And behind the trucks stood another powerful symbol: the 23,000 drivers who operated the Red Ball Express. Nearly 3/4 of them African American soldiers, serving in a segregated army that denied them full equality. Yet those men drove through exhaustion, through dangerous roads, through constant pressure to keep moving. They delivered the supplies that allowed Allied armies to cross France, break German defenses, and reach the borders of the Third Reich. Their work proved something that many German officers could barely comprehend. Industrial power had become the decisive weapon of modern war. In the end, the Red Ball Express proved a lesson that would shape military thinking for generations. Victory in modern war does not belong to the army with the best tactics. It belongs to the army that can move the most resources the fastest. And in 1944, no nation on earth could do that better than the United States. The German generals who laughed at American logistics in August 1944 would sign surrender documents less than a year later. Defeated not only by tanks and aircraft, but by an endless convoy of trucks rolling east across France. The Red Ball Express had turned highways into weapons. And in doing so, it changed the nature of war forever.